The most familiar sandwich on earth has a name that makes no sense. It's a hamburger with no ham in it, no ham even near it. Just beef ground up, shaped into a circle, and handed to billions of people under a confusing name for over a century. The word hamburger just became so familiar that no one questions it, which is exactly what makes it worth pulling apart. It's a story about an industrial food system, protein chemistry, a legal definition most people have never heard of, and a language accident so contagious it rewrote the English vocabulary around it. The name was never really about the type of meat. So what was it about? Let's start with the obvious thought. You hear hamburger, and your brain tries to split it. Ham, and then burger, like two food words fused together. And if you're feeling analytical about it, you start wondering, is burger the bread part? Is ham just wrong? Did someone make a typo centuries ago that the whole world decided to accept? That entire line of thinking is a trap. The word hamburger was never built from ham, the meat plus some second part. That's just how modern English speakers hear it. And that misunderstanding actually became productive for the food industry, but we'll dive into that later in the video. The actual root is Hamburg, the German city, which raises a much better question. How does a German city end up wrapped in paper at a drive-thru? Before hamburger was food, it was basically a passport entry. The word shows up in English as far back as the 1610s, and at that point it had nothing to do with lunch. It was a proper noun, a label for a person from Hamburg, or something connected to the city. Totally normal, actually. Languages do this constantly. A place name becomes a shorthand for something linked to that place. Nobody finds it weird when you say a fabric is denim because it came from Nîmes, or that something is Spartan because of Sparta. But were hamburgers first made in Hamburg? Here is the part of the story where everyone wants a clean answer, and history refuses to give one. Who invented the hamburger? Honestly, there are multiple stories. One is of Charlie Negreen, a 15-year-old, selling meatballs at a county fair in Wisconsin in 1885. The business was slow because, as it turns out, people don't want to stop walking to eat a meatball, so he decided to make something different. He flattened the meatballs, put them between bread so people could just grab a sandwich and move on. This is the story the town of Seymour still tells about the origin of the hamburger. They even built the Hamburger Hall of Fame to commemorate the story. The second story takes place in the same year, at a different fair. Frank and Charles Menches run out of pork for their sandwiches at the Erie County Fair in Hamburg, New York. The butcher suggests beef. They grind it up, mix in some brown sugar and coffee, serve it between two slices of bread, and apparently name it after the fair they're standing at. Frank allegedly just looked up, saw the Hamburg banner, and went with it. Then there's Oscar Bilby, in 1891, who makes a case that nobody else can. He's the first one documented to have served the patty on an actual bun, not bread. A proper bun, made from scratch, 4th of July, on a farm just outside Tulsa. The governor of Oklahoma later issued an actual official proclamation about it. And lastly is Louis Lasson in New Haven, around the year 1900, who didn't want to waste the excess beef scraps he had in the lunch wagon he ran. He cooked the meat up, put it between two pieces of toast, and handed it to a customer who was in a hurry. 4 stories in 4 states, but no one knows which is true. And here's the thing, that chaos is actually more interesting than a clean answer would be. Because what it tells you is that the hamburger sandwich didn't spring from one genius moment. It emerged from multiple people, in multiple places, working with similar ingredients and similar problems, and landed on a similar solution. Ground beef, portable, fast, in your hand. And once the sandwich did catch on, the question of who invented it started to matter a lot less than a different question entirely. Why did this specific food take over the world? Taste is not the reason. Well, taste helped. But plenty of tasty things never conquered the planet. The hamburger didn't win on flavor alone. It won because it fit the shape of modern life almost perfectly. Think about what ground beef actually is from an industrial standpoint. It's easy to portion, easy to shape, easy to standardize, easy to cook at scale. A hamburger is not just a recipe, it's a format. It turns meat into repeatable, shippable, manufacturable units. And the numbers reflect this. In 2022, retail ground beef accounted for $11.02 billion in expenditure and made up 51% of all beef sales. The hamburger isn't on the edge of the beef economy. It kind of is the beef economy. Once food becomes a unit, industry starts engineering it, which is where White Castle enters the story, and this detail is genuinely delightful. White Castle's square patties had 5 holes punched through them, not for aesthetics or branding. The holes let steam cook the meat from the inside, so they didn't even have to flip the patties. A hamburger had become a machine-friendly food, a meal designed for repetition, consistency, and speed. But if the burger is engineered, what is actually happening inside the meat that makes it hold together the way it does? A burger works because chemistry is being managed. You've probably felt this without having the words for it. Some burgers crumble apart when you bite them. Others have this satisfying cohesion, springy, unified, a clean bite through the whole thing. That difference isn't just technique. Salt is part of the mechanism. In ground beef, salt helps extract what are called salt-soluble myofibrillar proteins. Those proteins are part of the hidden structural system of the patty. They act like a kind of edible glue, helping all the tiny pieces of meat bind into one solid patty. Then heat takes over, and it does not act all at once. As a burger cooks, its proteins don't change all at once. They change in stages. First, one group of proteins called myosin starts to tighten. Then the rest of the myosin follows. Then other proteins in the meat change, and finally a protein called actin firms up. That step-by-step process is what controls how firm, juicy, or tender the burger feels as the heat rises. So when you cook a burger, you are not just heating up meat. You are running a timed, sequential transformation of protein structures. And if you thought that was the deepest layer of this story, there is still one more twist left. Because in the eyes of the law, hamburger has a strict definition. You could say that hamburgers are basically just ground beef, but the law would disagree. A hamburger is permitted to contain added beef fat up to 30%. Ground beef, by contrast, cannot have fat added beyond what's naturally present in the cuts being ground. That sounds bureaucratic, but think about what it means. Hamburger is not just a casual everyday word. It is a regulated category, a term with a specific legal definition. There are rules about what can and cannot carry that label. So the word that feels the most ordinary, the one you've been reading on signs your whole life without thinking about it, is quietly doing legal work in the background. Which brings us to the most fascinating part of the whole story, not how the hamburger was made, but what people did to the word itself. As we touched on earlier, at some point, English speakers stopped hearing hamburger as a single inherited word from a city name, and started hearing it as 2 parts, ham and burger. Linguists have a name for this. It's called rebracketing, or false splitting. The word got mentally chopped in a way that had nothing to do with its actual history. And here's the part that's kind of beautiful. The mistake didn't just confuse people. It became productive. Once burger started feeling like a detachable, meaningful piece, language started treating it that way. Cheeseburger shows up documented in 1938. Beef burger in 1940. Neither of those is an original root word. Both of them are products of a misunderstanding that went so deep it started generating new vocabulary. The reanalysis spread until the error became the system. And that is what makes the hamburger genuinely strange as a word. Not that it was always confusing, but that the confusion was so widespread, so consistent, and so generative that it reshaped the language around it. Step back and look at what this word has actually been through. It started as a reference to a German city. It entered English and became the name of a U.S. city. It migrated onto food, becoming a sandwich so perfectly suited to industrial production that it took over the world. Its label is a legally regulated category. And then, after all of that, the public unconsciously dismantled the word and rebuilt it into an entirely new naming system that spawned a whole family of new food words. That's a remarkable journey for something you eat with fries. One more thing worth mentioning before we close this out. You've probably heard the story about Mongol cavalry tenderizing raw meat under their saddles while riding into battle, the idea being that this was some kind of ancient ancestor of the hamburger patty. It gets repeated constantly, and honestly, it's a great mental image. Genghis Khan's warriors galloping across Central Asia, essentially slow-cooking lunch with their horses. But modern historians are pretty skeptical it actually happened. The practical problem is obvious once you think about it. Putting raw meat under a saddle would spoil it because of the heat horses generate and the chemicals they secrete. The story seems to have traveled through European accounts of the Mongols, picking up embellishment along the way, until it hardened into legend. A compelling origin story retrofitted onto a dish, rather than an accurate record of how that dish actually came to be. So the Mongol connection to the hamburger is probably more folklore than fact. But the hamburger story doesn't need a legend. The real history is already epic enough on its own.